one of the things that I feel quite strongly about, and I know not everyone is going to agree with me on this, but I'm going to say it anyway. And if I had to go back to myself 10 years ago, I would say diagnosis doesn't matter as much as you think it does. And I say that because I was finding it really hard to get a diagnosis for my child. She didn't quite fit into the boxes that are available. And also, she wouldn't comply with a lot of the assessments. She just refused to do anything. She has massive demand avoidance. It's got a little bit better, but she still hates those assessments because she feels like she's being judged, and so she just won't do anything. And as a result, it was really difficult to get a diagnosis for her. And I also had professionals completely disagreeing with each other. I thought she was dyspraxic, and I had an OT who agreed with me, and the paediatrician said, well, she can't be because she can ride a bike. Now, I knew I had a friend whose child had just been diagnosed as dyspraxic, and he could ride a bike. And I was just tearing my hair out because I just felt I had to know, I had to have this label. And I really destroyed myself over it. And actually, it was quite unpleasant, I have to say. I remember having this conversation with an OT where I just totally lost my rag at her. And I don't know her name, but I would like to make a formal apology to that OT. I did not behave well. I was incredibly stressed. And actually, I was putting too much emphasis in that need to be diagnosed. My daughter still isn't actually diagnosed, although I think I know what she has, and I know it's going to be enormously difficult for her to get that diagnosis. And she doesn't want to do it. And she's at an age now where I feel I have to respect that. And the fact is, we have managed without it. We have talked together, me and my daughter, about her needs, about what I think has happened to her brain and how her brain works. And she gets that. And it's taken a bit of time, and there is some difficulties that she has around not being the same as her friends, but there is an increasing acceptance from her. And so I've basically just stopped chasing the diagnosis, and it lifted a massive weight off my shoulders. Now, that's not to say she doesn't have assessments. She does. She still hates them, but sometimes she just has to do them. So we have a massive educational psychologist assessment. It took a day and a half to do. It is extremely thorough. It is actually from that assessment that led me to believe that she has this particular condition, and led me to go and research that condition. And I act as if she has that condition, even though she doesn't have the diagnosis, and I don't know that she ever will. I use that educational psychologist report for all the support, like EHCPs. I sent it off to get my disability living allowance. I use it for all sorts of things. She has annual assessments from speech and language therapists. She also has some other additional assessments on a fairly regular basis, like every few years. So I keep the assessments going. But I've stopped chasing that diagnosis because it was driving me insane. It was actually causing mental health problems for my daughter as well, because she was just being dragged from one medical professional, child professional to another, and it was just destroying her. So we just let it go. And I think it's really important to know your child's needs. I think it's really important to talk to your child. But do you need the label? My personal opinion is no. Now, you might totally disagree with everything that I've just said, and that's fine. If you really feel that this diagnosis is important, if you think it will bring things to yourself and your child to know exactly what's going on, then absolutely go for it. But I would say, if your child is reluctant, then please don't push them into these things if it's going to really destroy their mental health. Because you can get support without it. We have a very high level of funding for our EHCP. We have a place at a special school. We have higher rate care on the disability living allowance, and I have a bunch of other support. It is possible. I'm not lucky. That's what someone said to me once. It's not just because I'm lucky. I have worked hard. I have made sure my ducks are in a row. You can do it. And I would also say that if you are going to go ahead with the diagnosis and you're looking at a 2-year wait for that, don't feel that there's nothing that you can do in the meantime. So much of the support and help and healing that our children need comes in relationship with our child. So it happens between the parent and child. And on subsequent episodes, I'm going to go into this much more about what you can do at home. I actually heard a stat. I mean, I've not checked to see what the evidence for it, but someone said around 80% of the support, help and healing that your child will do will be at home in relationship with you. So just bear that in mind if you haven't got the diagnosis yet, or even I know people who have gone for diagnosis and they've been told, no, sorry, you just don't meet the criteria. And that's another thing to think about, actually. If you're on the road to diagnosis, how are you going to cope if you're told, no, sorry, you don't meet the criteria? Because that can be really crushing when you think your child has this condition, or your child really thinks they have the condition, and then they're told, no, they don't. I do know a child that's happened to recently, and she's really struggled emotionally with it. So also think about that. I would say the criteria for all of these assessments are quite arbitrary. It's worth knowing actually how they come about. So there is a manual called the DSM, and this is where all the diagnostic criteria for things like autism and ADHD and OCD and all the rest of it, that's where the criteria is for these diagnoses. And every few years they do update it. But it's important to know where the DSM came from. It was basically created in the US on the request of American insurance companies, because as I'm sure all of you will know, in the US they don't have the NHS, and most people have some kind of insurance to pay for things like assessments. And the insurance companies wanted to know what they should and shouldn't be paying out for. And it was more complicated with mental disorders. I'm using the terminology of the DSM here. I don't really like that term myself. But it was difficult with them. It's difficult. People say it's just like a broken leg. No, it isn't like a broken leg. It's actually much more vague. We know a lot less about the brain and how it works. And the insurance companies just needed or wanted some guidance about what they should be paying out for. And that was how the DSM was born. So it was driven by profit, basically. It wasn't driven by people, it was driven by profit. And we've taken it on in the UK, even though it's a US initiative for US purposes, even though most people here use the NHS rather than have private healthcare cover. We use the DSM for diagnosis as well. And there is a growing movement. I saw a report from Cambridge University this week that said that we haven't got this right with the criteria yet. There's a lot of people at the moment that are saying autism and ADHD are actually one in the same. There's a range, because lots of kids will get a diagnosis for both. But there are some people who are saying, actually, it's the same thing. And there are such varying degrees of difficulties within these conditions. I mean, you can have two autistic people who are completely different. One might be going off to university and the other can't actually speak at all. So the wide varying needs within these labels also make the diagnostic criteria quite problematic, actually. So if you're not getting a diagnosis and you're feeling really upset or your child's feeling really upset, no, this is not an exact science, and it doesn't mean that you don't have needs, and it doesn't mean you don't need support. And I would go and get those further assessments, educational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists. If you've got the money, go private. There's sometimes better quality, those private ones. Get those anyway, because they will list needs, and that means that you can still get support.